I'm Eliza Monroe, 27 years old. Until 6 months ago, I believed family meant showing up when it mattered most. Then my parents proved me wrong in the cruelest way possible. 4 months in a hospital bed after a head-on collision with a drunk driver, and they visited exactly 0 times. Not once. My mother's voice still echoes in my mind from our only phone call. Eliza, we're just so busy with the new house renovations, and hospitals make your father anxious. What they didn't know was that I'd been sending them monthly checks for 2 years to help with Dad's medical bills. Here's what makes this story unbelievable. The day after my grandfather's funeral, they finally showed up not to comfort me, but to contest his will. How do you fight people who only remember you exist when there's money involved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you, the morning light filtered through my apartment windows in downtown Asheville, casting long shadows across my cluttered art desk. Coffee in hand, I stared at the hospital bracelet I kept on my nightstand for 3 weeks since. My discharge? The plastic was yellowed now, a constant reminder of everything that had changed. My name is Eliza Monroe, and until that rainy Tuesday in March when a drunk driver ran a red light, I thought I understood my place in the world. I was a freelance illustrator, making enough to get by, living in a converted warehouse apartment that smelled like turpentine and dreams. My life was quiet, predictable, and mine, but that morning, as I traced the raised letters of my name on the bracelet, I realized how little I actually knew about family, love, or what it meant to matter to someone. The accident itself was brutal. In its simplicity. One moment I was driving home from a client meeting, singing along to an old Joni Mitchell song, and the next I was waking up in intensive care with a shattered collarbone, 3 broken ribs, and a traumatic brain injury that would keep me hospitalized for 4 months. June found me first. My best friend since college, she dropped everything when the hospital called her as my emergency contact. I remember fragments of those early days, her hand holding mine, her voice reading to me from my favorite books, her presence filling the spaces where family should have been. Your parents know, she told me gently during my 2nd week. I called them. I waited. The flowers never came. The visits never happened. The phone calls were brief, distant, filled with excuses about renovation schedules and Dad's anxiety around medical facilities. My grandfather, though he was different. At 83, Isaac Monroe made the 4-hour drive from his mountain home 3 times during my recovery. Each visit, he brought something small. A sketch he'd made of the view from my hospital window, a smooth river stone from his property, a pressed flower from his garden. Your parents were always afraid of fragility, he told me during his last visit, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted my blanket. They see broken things as inconvenient rather than human. I understood art the way other people understood. Breathing. He'd been a landscape painter his entire adult life, living in a converted barn studio on 40 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains. As a child, I'd spent every summer with him, learning to see light and shadow, to capture the soul of a place on canvas. You have the gift, Eliza, he'd always said. Not just for seeing, but for feeling. That's rarer than people think. Now, staring at my apartment filled with half-finished illustrations and empty coffee cups, I wondered if that gift was enough to rebuild a life that felt fundamentally altered. The knock on my door came at 9:30, interrupting my morning routine of coffee and contemplation. Through the peephole, I saw June balancing a bag of pastries and what looked like serious news on her face. You need to sit down, she said the moment I opened the door. June had been my anchor these past months. She'd taken leave from her nursing job, practically moved into my apartment during my recovery and never once made me feel like a burden. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual messy bun, and her brown eyes held a mixture of concern. Something I couldn't quite identify. What's wrong? I asked, though part of me already knew. The same part that had been dreading this phone call for months. "It's your grandfather," she said softly. "Miles called this morning. Ike passed away yesterday evening." The words hit me like another collision, stealing my breath in the same sudden way. I sank onto my couch, the hospital bracelet still clutched in my hand. Ike had been more than my grandfather. He'd been my refuge, my teacher, my one blood relative who saw me as more than an obligation or disappointment. The summers I'd spent at his mountain home had shaped me more than any formal education. He taught me to paint, yes, but more importantly, he taught me to value quiet strength over loud performance, authenticity over approval. "The funeral is tomorrow," June continued, sitting beside me. "Miles said Ike had been sick for a while, but didn't want anyone to worry. He went peacefully in his sleep. I thought about my last conversation with him just 2 weeks ago. He'd called to check on my progress as he did every few days since my discharge. We talked about my latest illustration project, about the changing seasons, about everything except the fact that he was dying. Did he?" I started, then stopped. The question felt selfish. Did he what? Did he mention me? I mean, did he say anything about? I gestured vaguely at myself, at my apartment, at the life I was still trying to piece back together. June smiled, the kind of smile that held secrets and comfort in equal measure. "Miles said there's a will reading scheduled for the day after the funeral. You're specifically mentioned." The idea of inheritance felt abstract, almost irrelevant in the face of losing the one person who'd never made me feel like I had to earn his love. But there was something in June's expression that suggested this was more than a token gesture, more than a small monetary gift or sentimental keepsake. That afternoon, I drove up to Ike's property for the first time since before my accident. The winding mountain road felt different somehow, charged with the weight of goodbye. His converted barn studio sat exactly as I remembered it, weathered wood and large windows, surrounded by the kind of wilderness that had inspired 3 decades of his paintings. Miles met me at the door. I'd known him peripherally for years. He'd been one of Ike's art students in his early 20s and had stayed close to my grandfather even after establishing his own law practice in Asheville. He was quiet, bookish, with the kind of gentle presence that made people feel heard. "I'm so sorry, Eliza," he said, and I could tell he meant it. He talked about you constantly, especially these past few months. Walking through Ike's studio felt like moving through a living memory. Canvases lined the walls, some finished, some abandoned mid-brushstroke. His easel still held his final painting, a view of the sunrise over the Blue Ridge, soft and luminous in the way only he could capture. "He finished that one last week," Miles said, following my gaze. "He said it was for someone special, but he wouldn't tell me who." On Ike's desk, among the usual clutter of brushes and paint tubes, I found a letter with my name written in his careful script. Inside, just a few lines. "Eliza, the only inheritance worth giving is the courage to live authentically. Everything else is just things. But sometimes things can help us remember who we're meant to be. I love you. Ike." I folded the letter carefully, tucking it into my pocket next to the hospital bracelet. 2 pieces of plastic and paper that somehow contained the entire story of who had mattered and who hadn't during the hardest months of my life. The funeral the next day was small, intimate. A handful of local artists, some neighbors, Miles, June, and me. Conspicuously absent were my parents and my sister Claire. They'd sent flowers expensive, impersonal arrangements that looked more like corporate apologies than expressions of grief. As we lowered Ike's casket into the mountain earth, he painted so many times, I felt the weight of becoming truly alone in the world. Not physically, June stood beside me, solid and present, but alone in the way that comes from losing the last person who knew your history and loved you anyway. But I also felt something else, a strange sense of anticipation, as if Ike's death wasn't just an ending, but a beginning I couldn't yet understand. The will reading was scheduled for the following morning at Miles's office. As I drove back to Asheville that evening, I tried to prepare myself for whatever small gesture of love my grandfather had behind. Maybe a painting, maybe enough money to help with my medical bills, maybe just the comfort of knowing I mattered to him. I had no idea that Ike's final gift would be the catalyst for the biggest fight of my life, and the thing that would finally teach me the difference between family and relatives. Miles's law office sat in a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of downtown Asheville, its rooms lined with law books and the kind of comfortable furniture that invited honest conversation. I arrived early, settling into one of the leather chairs in his conference room with coffee that tasted better than anything I managed to make at home lately. "Before we begin," Miles said, organizing papers at the head of the table, "I want you to know that your grandfather was very specific about his wishes. He updated his will just 6 months ago, and he was completely lucid when he made these decisions." Something in his tone made me sit up straighter. This didn't sound like the simple reading I expected. "Who else is coming?" I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew the answer. "Your parents should be here shortly." "And your sister?" My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen Claire in over a year, not since Christmas dinner had ended in one of her dramatic exits over something I couldn't even remember now. And my parents, well, their sudden interest in family gatherings felt ominous. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock, and there they were, Vivian and Daniel Monroe, looking like they were attending a business meeting rather than honoring their father's final wishes. My mother wore her usual armor of expensive clothing and perfect makeup, while my father hung slightly behind her. Checking his phone, behind them came Claire, 24 and beautiful in the way that had always made me feel like the plain older sister. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her outfit carefully chosen to suggest both grief and sophistication. "Eliza," my mother said, offering me the kind of brief hug that managed to avoid actual contact. "You look tired. Are you eating enough?" It was the most concern she'd shown for my well-being in months, and it felt performative, calculated for the present audience. Claire offered a small wave, but didn't approach. We'd grown apart over the years, especially after I'd started spending more time with Ike. She'd always resented what she saw as my special relationship with our grandfather, though she'd never bothered to cultivate one of her own. "Thank you all for coming," Miles began once we were seated. Isaac Monroe was very clear about his intentions, and he asked me to read his words exactly as he wrote them. He opened the official-looking document and began to read. "I, Isaac Monroe, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my worldly possessions with great thought and love. To my son Daniel and daughter-in-law Vivian, I leave my gratitude for raising 2 remarkable daughters, and my hope that they will one day understand the difference between loving someone and loving the idea of someone." My mother's lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. This was not starting the way she'd expected. "To my granddaughter Claire, I leave my collection of art books and $5,000, with the hope that she will use both to discover her own passion rather than coveting someone else's." Claire's face flushed, but she remained silent. To my granddaughter Eliza, who's been the light of my later years and the keeper of my artistic spirit, I leave the entirety of my property, the 40-acre estate, the barn studio, all of my paintings, and art supplies, and the remainder of my financial assets, currently valued at approximately $400,000. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the air in the room shift, watched my family's expressions change from polite attention to something much sharper. Miles continued reading. However, this inheritance comes with one condition. Eliza must live on the property for a full calendar year before she can sell any portion of it. If she chooses not to fulfill this condition, the entire estate will be donated to the Asheville Arts Foundation. That's ridiculous, my mother said, the first words she'd spoken since the reading began. Eliza can't possibly live up there alone. She's just recovered from a serious accident. This is clearly the decision of someone who wasn't thinking clearly. Actually, Miles replied calmly, your father specifically anticipated that reaction. He included a letter explaining his reasoning. Would you like me to read it? Yes, I said before anyone else could object. Miles opened a second envelope and began to read in Ike's voice. Words that felt like one final conversation with a man who'd understood me better than anyone. If you're hearing this, it means my family is questioning my judgment, which proves exactly why I made these decisions. Eliza, you are the only one who ever visited my home because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated. You are the only one who saw my art as an expression of soul rather than a potential commodity. And you are the only one who understands that sometimes we have to lose everything to discover what actually matters. The year on the mountain will not be easy, but it will teach you things about yourself that no amount of family approval ever could. You've always sought love from people who were incapable of giving it freely. This inheritance is not about money, it is about giving you the space and time to stop performing for an audience that was never truly watching to my son and his family. If you are angry about these decisions, ask yourselves why you assumed. You deserve something you never showed interest in while I was alive. Eliza earned this inheritance through 27 years of genuine affection, not expectation. My final wish is that this gift helps Eliza build the life she deserves rather than the life others expect her to live. The letter's words hung in the air like incense, beautiful and suffocating at the same time. I felt exposed, as if Ike had laid bare every difficult truth about our family dynamics for everyone to see. This is unacceptable, my mother said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Isaac was clearly manipulated. Eliza has been isolated with him for years, filling his head with ideas about family dysfunction. This will is the result of undue influence. That's not true, I said, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. Isn't it? Claire spoke up, her tone bitter. You were always his favorite, Eliza. Every summer, every holiday. Every family gathering was about your special bond with Grandpa Ike. The rest of us were just background noise. Because the rest of you never bothered to actually spend time with him, I shot back, anger rising in my chest. When was the last time any of you visited his studio? When was the last time you called in just to talk? We had our own lives to manage, my father said, speaking for the first time. Not everyone can afford to spend months playing artist in the mountains. The dismissal in his voice, the reduction of my relationship with Ike to playing artist, hit me like a physical blow. These people truly didn't understand what they'd lost, what they'd never bothered to value. There are legal grounds to contest this will, my mother continued, pulling out her phone. I'm calling our attorney. Contested on what basis? Miles asked, his professional calm never wavering. Undue influence. Diminished capacity. the unreasonable conditions attached to the inheritance. She was already dialing, her movements sharp and determined. "Mrs. Monroe," Miles said gently, "I've been your father's attorney for 15 years. He was evaluated by 2 independent physicians before making these changes. He was completely competent and his reasoning is well documented. But my mother was already speaking to someone on the phone, stepping into the hallway to discuss legal strategies. My father followed her, leaving just Claire and me in the conference room with Miles. "I can't believe he did this," Claire said, her voice small and hurt. $5,000 and some books. That's what my relationship with my grandfather was worth. For the first time since the reading began, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my sister. "Claire, it was never about the money." "Easy for you to say," she interrupted. "You just inherited almost $500,000. I got the consolation prize." She gathered her purse and headed for the door, then turned back. "You know what the worst part is?" He was right. I never really tried to know him. But neither did you until you needed something. "That's not fair," I started. But she was already gone. Miles, and I sat in silence for several minutes, listening to my mother's voice growing more agitated in the hallway. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Ike knew this would be difficult, but he believed it was necessary. Was he right? I asked. About me seeking love from people who couldn't give it? Miles considered the question carefully. "I think your grandfather saw something in you that you're still learning to see in yourself. The year on the mountain, if you choose to accept it, isn't just about an inheritance. It's about discovering who you are when you're not trying to earn anyone's approval." My mother returned, her face flushed with determination. "We're contesting the will. Our attorney says we have several viable grounds for challenge. Eliza, I hope you understand this isn't personal. This is about protecting the family." "Protecting the family from what?" I asked. "From making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. You can't possibly handle that property alone, especially after your accident. And the condition about living there for a year? It's manipulative and unrealistic." Looking at my mother's face, beautiful, composed, and completely certain of her righteousness, I realized that Ike had been preparing me for this moment without my knowing it. Every conversation about authenticity, every lesson about the difference between being loved and being needed had been leading to this choice. "I'm accepting the inheritance," I said quietly. "All of it, including the condition." The words surprised me as much as they surprised everyone else. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't consciously made the decision, but hearing them out loud felt right in a way that nothing had felt right in months. "Eliza, don't be impulsive," my father said. "This is a major decision that affects your entire future." "For the first time in my life," I replied, "I'm making a decision based on what I want rather than what I think will make other people happy. That feels like exactly the right way to honor Ike's memory." My mother's expression hardened into something I'd seen before but never quite recognized. The look of someone who'd just discovered they couldn't control the outcome of a situation. "Then we'll see you in court," she said coldly. "I won't let you destroy your own future out of some misguided sense of sentiment." As my parents left the office, I realized that the battle lines had been drawn not just over an inheritance, but over 2 completely different ideas of what family should be. They saw love as conditional, earned through compliance and performance. Ike had seen it as unconditional, given freely and without expectation of return. For the first time since my accident, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Even if I had no idea what came next, the drive up to Ike's property, my property now, legally speaking, felt different than it had during all those childhood summers. The winding mountain roads seemed narrower, The woods deeper, the isolation more. Profound. I've made this trip hundreds of times before, but never as the owner. Never with the weight of a contested inheritance pressing down on my shoulders. June had insisted on coming with me for this first official visit since accepting the will. She sat in the passenger seat of my aging Honda, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand when the silence stretched too long. "Second thoughts?" she asked as we rounded the final curve and the barn studio came into view. "Constant second thoughts," I admitted. But also this weird feeling that I'm finally doing something right. The property looked exactly as it had during Ike's funeral, yet somehow different now that it belonged to me. 40 acres of Blue Ridge wilderness, with the converted barn serving as both home and studio, and a smaller outbuilding that had always been my favorite place to read during summer visits. Miles had given me the keys the day before, along with a folder containing property documents, utility information, and what felt like the administrative weight of an entire life. Standing on the front porch now, key in hand, I felt the magnitude of what I committed to. 1 year. 12 months of living here alone, away from the life I built in Asheville, away from the safety of my apartment, and the proximity to June's steady presence. 12 months to figure out who I was when I wasn't trying to earn my parents' approval, or recover from their absence. The front door opened with the familiar creak I remembered from childhood. Inside, everything remained exactly as Ike had left it, coffee cups still on the kitchen counter, reading glasses folded beside his favorite chair, half-finished crossword puzzle on the side table. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "God, it's like he just tapped out for a walk," June said softly, running her fingers along the mantel lined with family photos. The photos told the story of my relationship with Ike better than any will or letter could. There I was at age 7, paint smudged on my cheek, holding up my first attempt at a landscape. At 12, serious and focused as Ike showed me how to mix colors. At 16, laughing at something he'd said while we worked side by side in the studio. Conspicuously absent from most of the photos were my parents and Claire. They appeared in formal family portraits from holidays and special occasions, but the candid shots, the ones that captured actual joy and connection, featured just Ike and me. "No wonder they're angry," June observed, studying the visual narrative of our family dynamics. "These pictures make it pretty clear where his heart was. The studio itself took my breath away, just as it always had. The main room soared to cathedral height with windows on 3 sides that flooded the space with mountain light. Easels stood at various angles, some holding finished canvases, others draped with cloth to protect works in progress. But it was the paintings themselves that made me sit down hard on one of Ike's paint-splattered stools. I'd seen his work my entire life, but experiencing it now as the inheritor of his artistic legacy felt overwhelming. Landscapes that captured not just the visual beauty of the mountains, but their emotional resonance. Studies of light that seemed to glow from within. And scattered throughout, portraits I'd never seen before, sketches and paintings of me at various ages, seen through the eyes of someone who found me endlessly worthy of artistic attention. "He really saw you," June said, stopping in front of a painting I didn't remember him making. It showed me at maybe 25, sitting in the reading nook, completely absorbed in a book. The way he captured the light falling across my face, the sense of peaceful solitude, it was how I felt during my happiest moments with him. But I'd never realized he'd been observing those moments with such careful love. In the corner of the studio, I found something that made my throat close up completely. An easel set up at exactly my height. with a palette still holding dried paint and a note in Ike's handwriting taped to the canvas. For when you're ready to see the world through your own eyes instead of trying to see yourself through theirs. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. The attorney wants to meet tomorrow. This isn't over, Eliza. We're trying to protect you from making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. I showed the message to June, who read it with the kind of expression she usually reserved for particularly difficult patients. Protect you from what, exactly? Inheriting a beautiful property and the chance to live as an artist? Protect me from choosing sentiment over practicality, I said, echoing the arguments I'd been hearing from my family since the will reading. They think I'm being naive, that I can't handle the isolation or the responsibility. And what do you think? I looked around the studio at the evidence of Ike's 40-year love affair with this place, at the paintings that proved beauty could emerge from solitude, at the setup he'd created specifically for me to continue the work he'd started. I think they're probably right about the practical stuff, I admitted. I have no idea how to maintain a property this size, or whether I can actually make a living as an artist up here, or if I'll go completely crazy from the isolation. But I also think this is the first decision I've ever made that feels like it came from me instead of from what I thought other people wanted to hear. June nodded, understanding in the way that only real friends can. So, what's the plan? That was the question that had been keeping me awake since accepting the inheritance. I had savings enough to live modestly for several months, but no clear idea of how to make the mountain property sustainable long term. I had some illustration clients who could work with me remotely, but nowhere near enough to cover expenses. And I had absolutely no experience with the kind of self-sufficiency that mountain living required. I guess I figure it out as I go, I said, which sounded either brave or foolish. Depending on perspective. We spent the rest of the afternoon making practical lists, utilities to transfer, supplies to buy, logistics to arrange. June, ever the practical nurse, insisted we check every room for safety hazards and make note of repairs that needed immediate attention. The house itself was solid but showed its age. Built in the 1960s and renovated periodically over the decades. It had the kind of comfortable shabbiness that spoke of being lived in rather than merely maintained. The kitchen needed updating, the bathroom could use modern fixtures, and the heating system made concerning noises that suggested expensive repairs in my future. But there were also wonderful surprises, a library lined floor to ceiling with art, books and literature, a sunroom that would be perfect for morning coffee, and a basement workshop where Ike had apparently spent time woodworking and making his own frames. It's like he was preparing this place for someone to really live here, June observed, running her hand along the workshop's well-organized tool bench. Not just visit, but make a life. As the sun began to set, painting the studio walls in the golden light that Ike had captured in so many of his paintings, I made a decision that surprised even me. I'm staying tonight, I announced. Here? Alone? I have to start somewhere. And if I'm going to do this, really do this, I need to find out what it feels like to be here when it's just me. June looked concerned but didn't argue. She helped me find sheets for the guest bedroom and make sure I had enough food for breakfast. Before she left, she hugged me longer than usual. You know, I think this is either the best decision you've ever made or the worst, right? And I'm not sure there's a middle ground. That's what makes it interesting, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. After June's car disappeared down the mountain road, I stood on the front porch listening to the silence. It wasn't the empty quiet of my apartment in town, but a full silence layered with wind through trees, distant bird calls, and the subtle sounds of a living landscape. Inside, I made myself a simple dinner and sat in Ike's reading chair, trying to imagine what the next year would look like. The house felt enormous around me, full of memories and possibilities in equal measure. My phone rang just as I was getting ready for bed. My father's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity won out. "Eliza, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Your mother is serious about contesting the will, but I wanted to give you a chance to reconsider before this gets ugly." "Gets ugly how?" "Legal challenges are expensive and time-consuming, and they require examining all aspects of your relationship. With your grandfather, are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" The threat was subtle but clear. They would drag our family's private dynamics into public view if necessary. They would question every conversation I'd ever had with Ike, every summer visit, every phone call during my recovery. "Dad," I said carefully, "why didn't you visit me in the hospital?" The question hung between us for several seconds before he answered. "Your mother thought it would be better to let you focus on recovery without family stress. We knew June was taking good care of you." "And you agreed with that?" Another pause. "I agreed that sometimes the best way to help someone is to give them space." It was the most honest he'd ever been about his tendency to avoid difficult emotions. And somehow that made it worse than if he'd just made excuses. "The inheritance isn't about money, Dad. It's about Ike wanting me to have a chance to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to make everyone else comfortable." "And you think living alone on a mountain for a year is going to accomplish that?" "I think it's worth finding out." After I hung up, I realized that the conversation had clarified something important. My family's objections to the inheritance weren't really about protecting me. They were about maintaining a system where my role was to be the accommodating daughter, the one who didn't make waves or demand too much attention. But that version of me had been in a hospital bed for 4 months while they renovated bathrooms and managed their anxiety about medical facilities. That version of me had spent years sending money to help with Dad's bills while they built a new house. That version of me had been convenient for them, but it had never been sustainable for me. As I fell asleep in Ike's guest room, surrounded by the mountain silence and the weight of a year-long commitment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The possibility of becoming someone I actually wanted to be. 3 weeks into my life on the mountain, I established something resembling a routine. Mornings in the studio, trying to rediscover the artistic confidence that had been shaken loose during my recovery. Afternoons tackling the endless list of property maintenance tasks that came with 40 acres of wilderness. Evenings reading in Ike's library or working on illustration projects by lamplight. The solitude was both harder and easier than I'd expected. Harder because the silence amplified every doubt about whether I was making a catastrophic mistake. Easier because, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't performing for an audience or managing anyone else's emotions. But the legal battle was heating up, and the stress was beginning to show in everything I did. "Your mother's attorney filed a formal challenge yesterday," Miles told me during our weekly check-in call. "They're claiming undue influence and questioning your grandfather's mental capacity during his final months." I was sitting in the sunroom, watching morning light filter through the trees, trying to process how family love had become family litigation in less than a month. What does that mean for me? It means we need to document everything about your relationship with Ike, every visit, every conversation, every gift or financial transaction. They're going to try to paint a picture of manipulation, so we need to prove that your bond was genuine and long-standing. The irony was bitter. To defend my inheritance, I'd have to prove that my grandfather's love for me was real something. That had never been in question until money became involved. "There's something else," Miles continued, his voice careful. They've hired a private investigator to look into your financial situation over the past few years, specifically any money you might have given to family members. My stomach dropped. The monthly checks I'd been sending to help with Dad's medical bills money, I'd never mentioned to Ike because it felt private, personal, if they discovered. Those payments, would it look like I'd been buying my grandfather's affection through family generosity? Miles, I never told Ike about the money I was sending my parents. He didn't know about any of that. I believe you. But we need to be prepared for them to twist any financial entanglement into evidence of manipulation on your part. After the call, I found myself digging through Ike's desk, looking for anything that might help establish the timeline and nature of our relationship. What I found instead was something that made me sit down hard on his office chair. A manila folder labeled Eliza in his careful handwriting. Inside were things I'd never known he kept. Every birthday card I'd ever sent him. Every thank you. Note from childhood visits. Every email I'd written during college. But underneath those sentimental keepsakes was something more substantial. Bank records showing that Ike had been quietly contributing to my college fund, helping with my medical bills after the accident, and even supplementing my income during. The lean months when illustration work was scarce, he'd never told me about any of it. Never mentioned the financial support or made me feel obligated because of it. The help had been invisible, the way love should be given freely without expectation of recognition or return. At the bottom of the folder was a letter dated just 6 months before his death. If anyone ever questions why I left everything to Eliza, they should know this. She's the only member of my family who ever loved me without expecting something in return. She visited because she enjoyed my company, not because she felt obligated. She called to check on my well-being, not to manage my decisions. And when I helped her financially over the years, she never asked for more or assumed it would continue. The others see me as a source of potential inheritance. Eliza has always seen me as a person worth knowing. Reading his words felt like receiving one final hug from beyond the grave, but it also crystallized the impossible position I was in. To fight for my inheritance, I have to expose the very private generosity that made it meaningful in the first place. My phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Can we talk? Not about legal stuff, just us. I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. Come up to the house. We should talk here. She arrived that afternoon, looking smaller and more uncertain than I'd seen her since we were children. The confidence she'd worn at the will reading had been replaced by something more vulnerable. This place looks exactly the same, she said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs where we'd eaten countless breakfasts during childhood summers. Everything's the same except the person who made it feel like home, I replied, making tea. The way Ike always had strong and served in chipped mugs that had been his favorites for decades. I keep thinking about what he said in the letter, Claire began, not meeting my eyes. About how we only showed interest when we wanted something, and I hate that he was right. You were young when we used to visit here together. You shouldn't feel guilty about not maintaining a relationship with him when you were busy building your own life. But that's just it. I wasn't busy building anything meaningful. I was just existing, waiting for life to happen to me instead of making choices about what I wanted. Claire had always been the drifter in our family, moving from job to job, relationship to relationship, never quite settling into anything that felt permanent or purposeful. I'd assumed it was because she was still figuring things out, but sitting here now, I wondered if it was because she never learned how to value her own preferences over other people's expectations. What do you want now? I asked. I want to understand why he chose you. Not because I'm angry about the money. Well, not only because of that, but because I want to know what I missed. what I could have had if I'd been paying attention. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. And I realized that Claire's resentment wasn't really about the inheritance itself, but about the evidence it provided of a relationship she'd never bothered to cultivate. He would have loved you the same way if you'd let him, I said. Ike's love wasn't conditional, Claire. It was just ... available. You had to show up to receive it, but it was always there. Like yours was during the accident? The question surprised. What do you mean? I mean, you almost died and none of us were there for you. But you're sitting here having tea with me instead of telling me to go to hell. Why? I thought about it, watching the afternoon light shift across the kitchen, where Ike and I shared so many conversations about family, art, and what it meant to live authentically. Because holding grudges takes energy, I'd rather spend on other things. And because I think there's a difference between people who can't love well and people who just haven't learned how yet. Claire's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her since childhood. Mom and Dad are really going to fight this, you know? They've convinced themselves that you manipulated a sick old man, and they're going to make that case in court. Do you believe that? No, but I also don't think it matters what I believe. They're going to drag this through the legal system until you either give up or run out of money to fight them. That evening, after Claire left, I found myself back in the studio, looking at Ike's paintings with new eyes. Not just as beautiful objects, but as evidence of a life lived on his own terms. Every canvas represented a choice to prioritize authenticity. Over approval, artistic vision, over financial security. My phone rang, and June's name appeared on the screen. How are you holding up? She asked without preamble. Some days I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Other days I feel like I'm being crushed by the weight of other people's expectations. Welcome to adulthood, she said dryly. The trick is figuring out which expectations are worth meeting. My family thinks I'm being selfish and impractical. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they're scared that you're choosing yourself over them for the first time in your life, and they don't know how to handle it. June's words hit home in a way that made me sit down on Ike's paint-splattered stool. She was right, this wasn't really about money or property or even artistic legacy. This was about me finally claiming the right to make decisions based on my own values rather than other people's comfort levels. I miss him, I said suddenly. I miss being able to call him when things get complicated and having him remind me that most problems are smaller than they seem. What do you think he'd say about all this legal stuff? I thought about it, imagining Ike's voice with its blend of wisdom and gentle humor. He'd probably say that people who love you want you to be happy, and people who don't love you want you to be convenient, and that it's important to know the difference. Sounds like pretty good advice. After we hung up, I walked through the house, looking at it with fresh eyes, not as a burden or responsibility, but as a gift that came with challenges attached. Every room held memories of summers when I felt completely accepted, completely seen, completely valued for who I was, rather than who I might become. In the morning, I called Miles with a decision I hadn't realized I was ready to make. I want to fight this, I told him. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. This inheritance isn't just about money, it's about honoring the only person in my family who ever loved me unconditionally. It's going to get ugly, Eliza. They're going to question everything about your relationship with your grandfather. They're going to make you defend love in a court of law. Then that's what I'll do. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the legal battle was just the external manifestation of a fight I'd been having my entire life. The fight to be seen and valued for who I actually was rather than who other people wanted me to be. And for the first time since inheriting this beautiful, complicated legacy, I felt ready for that fight. The discovery happened by accident, the way most life-changing revelations do. I was cleaning out Ike's bedroom closet, sorting through clothes to donate and personal items to keep, when I knocked over a heavy wooden box tucked behind his winter coats. When it hit the floor, the impact revealed something I'd never noticed. The box had a false bottom, and underneath the thin wooden panel was a small metal safe. My hand shook as I tried the combination that Ike had always used for everything: my birthday, month, and year. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. On top was a letter addressed to me, dated just 3 weeks before Ike's death. My dear Eliza, if you're reading this, it means you've accepted my inheritance despite your family's objections, and you've begun to make the mountain your home. What you're about to learn will be difficult, but it will also free you from any remaining guilt about their anger. Your parents have been stealing from me for years. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Stealing, not borrowing. Not accepting gifts, but actual theft. The documents beneath the letter told a story that made my stomach turn. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals from Ike's accounts, forged signatures on checks, investment accounts that had been liquidated without his knowledge. The theft had been systematic, careful, and sophisticated, not the desperate act of someone in crisis, but the calculated behavior of people who felt entitled to his money while he was still alive. But there was more. Much more. A private investigator's report from 2 years ago detailed my parents' financial situation, the expensive house renovations I thought they were struggling to afford, the new cars, the luxury vacations they claimed were business trips. All of it funded by money stolen from Ike's accounts. And underneath the pie report was something that made me sink onto Ike's bed, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Medical records showing that my father's ongoing health issues were fabricated. The medical bills I'd been helping to pay for months, the ones that had drained my savings and made me feel guilty for not doing more, were for treatments he'd never received, procedures that had never happened. They'd been scamming me too. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to call Miles. When he answered, I could barely speak coherently. Miles, I found something. In Ike's room. Documents that change everything. Slow down. What kind of documents? Evidence that my parents had been stealing from him and lying to me about Dad's medical bills. For years, Miles, this has been going on for years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Eliza, where are you right now? At the house, in Ike's bedroom. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming up there. Miles, there's something else. The private investigator's report, it mentions you. It says Ike hired you to investigate the thefts. Another pause. We'll talk when I get there. While waiting for Miles, I sat in the kitchen staring at the documents spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what I discovered. It wasn't just that my parents had been stealing, it was that they'd been living a lie, so comprehensive that nothing about our family dynamics was what I'd believed it to be. The medical bills I'd felt guilty about not being able to cover more completely. The house renovations they'd claimed were straining their budget. The way they'd made me feel selfish for spending money on art, supplies, or taking time for my own recovery after the accident. All of it had been manipulation designed to cover up their theft. Miles arrived within an hour, carrying a briefcase and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd been dreading this conversation. How long have you known? I asked before he even sat down. Your grandfather hired me to investigate suspicious activity in his accounts about 18 months ago. We confirmed the thefts, but he chose not to prosecute. Why not? Miles set his briefcase on the table and pulled out a thick file. Because he hoped they would stop if they knew he was aware of what they were doing. He confronted them last Christmas. I remembered that Christmas dinner, the tension I'd attributed to normal family dynamics, the way my parents had left early. Claiming exhaustion, the strange undercurrent of anger that had colored the entire visit. They didn't stop, did they? No, in fact, the thefts accelerated after he confronted them. They took almost $40,000 in the 3 months before. His death, the number hit me like a physical blow. $40,000. While I'd been in the hospital, recovering from an accident and struggling with medical bills, my parents had stolen enough money to pay for my entire treatment. There's more, Miles continued, opening another folder. The medical bills you've been paying on your father's behalf, we traced them to a billing company that specializes in fake invoices for insurance fraud. Your father has been in perfect health for years. I thought about all the times I'd sent checks, all the guilt I'd felt about not being able to contribute more, all the conversations where they'd made me feel like a burden while they were actively stealing from both Ike and me. Did he know about the fake medical bills? He suspected. That's actually what prompted him to hire the investigator in the first place. He noticed that your financial contributions to the family seemed to coincide with unusual activity in his own accounts. So they were using his money to supplement what they were getting from me. More than that, they were using information about your payments to time their thefts. When you sent money for medical bills, they knew you were financially stretched. So they'd take larger amounts from Ike's accounts to compensate. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated that I couldn't process it emotionally. Instead, I found myself thinking like an accountant, trying to understand the mechanics of how they'd orchestrated it all. Why didn't he tell me? Miles's expression softened because he knew you'd blame yourself. He knew you'd think somehow you should have prevented it or seen it coming. And because he was hoping to resolve it without destroying your relationship with your parents. Even though they were stealing from him, Ike understood something about love that your parents never learned. It doesn't stop being love just because the other person doesn't deserve it. I looked at the documents scattered across the table, evidence of years of systematic deception and theft, and felt something inside me break clean in half. Not my heart, exactly, but my capacity to make excuses for people who had never deserved them. What happens now? Now you have a choice. We can use this evidence to end their legal challenge to the will immediately. No court is going to side with people who were stealing from the deceased. But doing that means making their crimes public, which could result in criminal charges. And if I don't use it, then we fight their challenge the hard way, and you risk losing everything your grandfather wanted you to have. I thought about my mother's voice during our last conversation, so certain of her righteousness as she talked about protecting me from my own poor judgment. I thought about my father's careful distance, his refusal to engage with difficult emotions, his willingness to let me struggle financially while he profited from lies. And I thought about Ike, dying alone with the knowledge that his own son was stealing from him, still hoping that love might eventually triumph over greed. There's something else you should see, Miles said, pulling out one final document. Your grandfather's final will wasn't the only legal document he prepared before his death. He handed me a notarized statement, signed and dated just 1 week before Ike passed away. I, Isaac Monroe, being of sound mind and body, do hereby state that any legal challenge to my will by Daniel Monroe or Vivian Lancaster Monroe should be met with full disclosure of their fraudulent activity as documented in the attached evidence. My granddaughter Eliza has earned her inheritance through 27 years of genuine love and respect. My son and daughter-in-law have forfeited any claim to my estate through their systematic theft and deception. If they choose to contest my final wishes, They should be prepared for the legal and financial consequences of their actions. He knew. They'd fight the will, I said. He was counting on it. This was his way of giving you the power to end the fight on your terms. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the mountain landscape that had become my refuge and my inheritance. Everything was different now, not just my understanding of my family, but my understanding of why Ike had structured his will the way he had. The year on the mountain wasn't just about discovering who I was without my family's approval. It was about learning to protect myself from people who would exploit my love for their own gain. Miles, I said, turning back to face him, I want you to call my parents' attorney. Tell them we need to meet tomorrow to settle, to end this. Once and for all. The night before our scheduled meeting with my parents' attorney, I couldn't sleep. I walked through Ike's house, my house touching familiar objects and thinking about how everything I believed about my family had been a carefully constructed lie dot in the studio. Surrounded by Ike's paintings, I tried to imagine the conversation he must have had with my parents last Christmas when he confronted them about the thefts. How had it felt to discover that his own son was stealing from him? How had he found the strength to continue loving people who saw him only as a source of money? Miles had prepared 3 folders of evidence, the banking records showing unauthorized, withdrawals, the private investigator's report documenting years of systematic theft, and the medical billing fraud that had been designed to manipulate me into supplementing their stolen income. You don't have to do this, he told me earlier that evening. We can handle the legal challenge without involving them directly. Once their attorney sees this evidence, they'll withdraw the will contest immediately. But I needed to face them. Not for closure or confrontation, but for clarity. I needed to look my parents in the eye and understand how people could live with themselves after betraying not just their father, but their daughter as well. June had driven up from Asheville to spend the night, insisting I shouldn't be alone before what she called the reckoning. Are you sure you're ready for this? She asked as we sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge over the mountains. I don't think anyone can be ready to learn that their entire family dynamic was based on fraud and manipulation. But I'm ready to stop pretending that love means accepting unacceptable behavior. What if they deny everything? Then they'll have to explain how Ike's signature got forged on dozens of bank withdrawal slips, and where $40,000 went in his final 3 months. June was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. You know what this means, don't you? About the hospital visits? I'd been trying not to think about that connection, but June was right to bring it up. My parents hadn't avoided visiting me during my recovery because hospitals made them anxious, or because they were busy with renovations. They'd avoided visiting because they were afraid I might notice their sudden financial improvement, might ask questions about how they could afford a new house while claiming to struggle with Dad's medical bills. My accident had been inconvenient for them, not because they were too busy to care, but because my vulnerability threatened to expose their lies. They let me believe I was a burden, I said quietly. They let me feel guilty about not being able to contribute more to Dad's medical costs while they were stealing money to fund their lifestyle. That's not love, Eliza. That's exploitation. In the morning, I dressed carefully for the meeting, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that I was no longer the accommodating daughter who prioritized other people's comfort over her own dignity. I wore Ike's paint-stained apron over my dress, a talisman of a love that had been real in my life. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the law offices downtown. Miles and I arrived early, setting up the conference room with methodical precision. The evidence folders were arranged on the table like cards in a high-stakes game, each one representing years of deception. Remember, Miles said as we waited, You don't owe them explanations or justifications. You're not here to convince them of anything. You're here to end their legal challenge and move forward with your life. My parents arrived exactly on time, accompanied by their attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she specialized in making problems disappear for wealthy clients. They entered the conference room with the confidence of people who believed they held all the power. "Eliza!" my mother said, offering me the same careful hug that managed to avoid actual warmth. "I hope you've reconsidered this whole mountain adventure. It's not too late to find a reasonable compromise." "That depends on what you consider reasonable," I replied, gesturing for everyone to sit. Their attorney opened her briefcase with efficient movements. "We're prepared to offer a settlement that allows Eliza to keep the property while distributing the financial assets more equitably among family members. Given the questionable circumstances surrounding the will's creation, we believe this represents a fair resolution." "Questionable circumstances?" Miles asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The isolated nature of Eliza's relationship with her grandfather in his final years, the dramatic change in his will shortly before his death, the unusual conditions attached to the inheritance. All of this suggests undue influence." I watched my parents' faces as their attorney spoke, looking for any sign of guilt or shame about the accusations they were making. Instead, I saw only the calculated determination of people who had convinced themselves they were the victims in this situation. "Before we discuss any settlement," Miles said, opening the first evidence folder, "there are some financial irregularities we need to address." He spread the bank statements across the table with deliberate precision. Month after month of unauthorized withdrawals, forged signatures, account transfers that happened without Ike's knowledge or consent. My mother's face went pale, but my father leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this moment. "We can explain those transactions," their attorney said quickly, but Miles continued laying out evidence. The private investigator's report, the documentation of my parents' luxury purchases funded by stolen money, the fake medical billing scheme that had been used to manipulate me into contributing to their fraudulent lifestyle. The total amount of documented theft exceeds $120,000 over the past 3 years, Miles said calmly. "This doesn't include the money fraudulently obtained from Eliza through fake medical bills." The silence in the room was complete. My parents' attorney was reading through the documents with growing alarm, clearly realizing that her clients had failed to mention some important details about their relationship with the deceased. "This is ridiculous," my mother said finally, her voice sharp with panic. "Isaac was confused in his final years. He forgot about authorizing those withdrawals. The forged signatures would suggest otherwise," Miles replied, pulling out handwriting analysis that clearly showed the differences between Ike's actual signature and the ones my parents had used. I looked at my father, who hadn't spoken since, entering the room. His face was gray, resigned, like someone who'd been caught in a lie he was tired of maintaining. "Dad," I said quietly, "did you really think I'd never find out?" He met my eyes for the first time since the meeting began, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been shame. "We were planning to pay it back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "With what money?" "The money you were stealing from me through fake medical bills." My mother turned on him with fury. "Daniel, don't say anything else." But something had broken in my father's carefully maintained facade. "She's right, Vivian. We've been living a lie for years, and now she knows everything. The question now," Miles continued, "is whether this matter gets resolved privately or becomes a criminal investigation. Bank fraud, forgery, elder abuse, these are serious charges that carry significant penalties. Their attorney was frantically taking notes, clearly trying to calculate how to minimize her client's legal exposure. "What do you want?" my mother asked, her voice stripped of its usual commanding tone. "I want you to withdraw your challenge to." "I will immediately and permanently," I said. "I want you to acknowledge in writing that you have no claim to his estate, and I want you to repay every dollar you stole from him." "We don't have that kind of money," my father said. "Then you'll have to sell the house you bought with his money and downsize to something you can actually afford." My mother's face was rigid with rage. "You're destroying this family over money, Eliza. Is that really what Isaac would have wanted?" The question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. "Ike wanted me too." "Understand the difference between people who love you and people who use you?" I replied. "Thank you for making that distinction so clear." I stood up, gathering my copy of the evidence files. "You have 48 hours to withdraw the will challenge and sign a repayment agreement. If you don't, Miles will file criminal charges, and this will all become very public." As I reached the conference room door, my father called out, "Eliza, wait." I turned back to look at him, this man who had helped create me but had never really bothered to know me. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in my life, he sounded like he meant it. "I know you are, Dad, but being sorry doesn't undo 27 years of being treated like an inconvenience instead of a daughter." Outside the law office, Miles and I stood in the parking lot, letting the weight of what had just happened settle. Between us, "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I just performed surgery on my own life," I said. "It hurt, but it was necessary." As we drove back up the mountain, I realized that the hardest part was over. Not the legal battle that would be resolved. Within days, once their attorney explained the realities of their situation to them, the hardest part was accepting that the people who should have loved me most had been willing to exploit that love for their own gain. But I also realized something else. I was free now in a way I'd never been before. Free from the guilt of not being good enough, free from the obligation to earn love through compliance, free to build a life based on my own values, rather than other people's expectations. The mountain house appeared around the final curve, solid and welcoming in the afternoon light. Home, not just the place where I was staying, but the place where I was learning to be myself without apology. 2 days later, I was painting in Ike's studio when Miles called with news I'd been expecting, but still felt surreal to hear. "They've signed everything," he said. "Will challenge withdrawn, repayment agreement executed, and a formal acknowledgement that they have no claim to your grandfather's estate." "It's over, Eliza." I set down my brush and looked out at the mountain view that was now legally and permanently mine to keep. The morning light was hitting the ridge in exactly the way Ike had captured in dozens of his paintings, and for the first time since inheriting this place, I felt like I truly belonged here. What happens next? Next, you live your life without looking over your shoulder. The repayment will be structured over 5 years, and they've agreed to have no contact with you unless you initiate it. You're free. After hanging up, I walked through the house, seeing it with new eyes, not as a burden or responsibility, but as a gift from someone who had loved me enough to fight for my future even when he was dying down in the kitchen. I made coffee, using Ike's old percolator, the same ritual that had marked my mornings here for weeks. But today it felt different, less like borrowing someone else's life and more like beginning my own. June arrived around noon, carrying groceries and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose friend had just won a significant victory. "So," she said, unpacking fresh vegetables and a bottle of wine, "how does it feel to be officially, legally, permanently free of family drama?" "Weird. Good weird, but weird." I keep expecting them to call or show up with some new argument or manipulation. They won't. You've taken away their power and they know it. The question now is what you do with your freedom. That afternoon, we worked together to transform Ike's studio into something that honored his legacy while making space for my own artistic voice. We moved some of his finished paintings to the house's main rooms, creating a gallery of his work. That felt more like a celebration than a museum. We set up a section of the studio specifically for my illustration work, with proper lighting and storage for the supplies I'd been accumulating. But the most important change was symbolic. I moved Ike's final painting, the sunrise over the blue ridge that he'd finished the week before he died, to a place of honor above my new workstation. Not as something to live up to, but as a reminder that art is about capturing the beauty you see in the world and sharing it with others. You know what this place needs? June said, stepping back to survey our work. What? People. Not all the time, but sometimes. You can't live up here in complete isolation and expect to stay sane. She was right, and I've been thinking about the same thing. The mountain house was perfect for solitude and reflection, but it was too beautiful and too spacious not to share occasionally. I've been thinking about hosting art workshops, I said tentatively. Nothing formal, just weekend retreats for people who want to paint in the mountains. Ike always said this place was meant to inspire creativity. That's perfect. You could use Ike's reputation to attract students, and the income would help with property maintenance. As we talked about possibilities, workshops, artist residencies, maybe even a small gallery space in the barn, I realized that inheriting this place hadn't just given me property. It had given me permission to imagine a life built around my own passions, rather than other people's expectations. That evening, as June prepared to drive back to Asheville, we sat on the front porch with wine and watched the sun set over the mountains. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. Not just for fighting the legal battle, but for choosing yourself when it mattered most. I had good teachers. Ike taught me that love doesn't require self-sacrifice. And you taught me that real friends show up even when there's nothing to be gained. What are you going to do about the loneliness? The mountain is beautiful, but it's also isolated. I've been thinking about that too. The solitude had been healing after months of family drama and legal stress, but I could already feel the pull toward connection and community. Miles mentioned that there's an artist cooperative in Asheville that might be interested in partnering with me on some projects. And there's a writing group that meets in town that I might join. I don't have to choose between solitude and society. I can have both on my own terms. After June left, I called Miles to finalize some last details about the settlement. There's something I want to tell you, he said after we covered the business matters. Working with your grandfather on this case, watching how he planned to protect you even after his death, it reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. Not all family stories end with justice. This one didn't end with justice either. It ended with freedom, which is better. Would you like to have dinner? Sometime when all of this legal complexity is behind us? The question surprised me. Not because I hadn't noticed the attraction building between us during weeks of working together, but because I hadn't expected to feel ready for any kind of romantic possibility so soon. I'd like that, I said. But maybe we could start with coffee? I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not managing family crises. Coffee sounds perfect. That night, alone in the mountain house for the first time since learning the truth about my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my accident. Genuine peace. Not the exhausted quiet that comes after a fight, but the deep calm that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. I walked through the studio, looking at the canvases Ike had left behind and the empty ones waiting for my own vision. Tomorrow, I would start painting again, not illustrations for other people's projects, but art that came from my own experience of beauty and truth. In Ike's bedroom, which I'd begun thinking of as my room, I found the folder of family photos I'd been avoiding since discovering the evidence of theft and manipulation. Looking at them now, I could see what I'd missed before. The difference between pictures that captured genuine connection and those that merely documented obligation. The formal family portraits showed us arranged in careful poses, everyone smiling on cue. But the candid shots, the ones taken during unguarded moments, revealed the truth. Ike and I absorbed in painting projects. My parents checking their phones or looking at watches. Claire restless and distracted, always seeming to wish she were somewhere else. The photos told the story that the legal documents had only confirmed. Some relationships are built on love, and others are built on convenience, and it's important to know the difference. I selected a few photos to keep, ones that reminded me of genuine happiness rather than performed family harmony, and put the rest away. Not throwing them out, but acknowledging that they belonged to a version of my life I was finished living. Before bed, I stood on the front porch one more time, breathing in the mountain air and listening to the night sounds that had become familiar friends. Owls calling to each other across the valley, wind through pine trees, the distant sound of water over rocks. This was home now. Not just the physical place, but the life I was building here, one honest relationship at a time, one authentic choice after another, one day of living according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I thought about Ike's final gift. Not just the house and studio and financial freedom, but the example he'd set of living authentically even when it cost him. Relationships with people he loved. He'd show me that it was possible to love people without enabling their worst impulses, to maintain boundaries without building walls, to choose solitude over compromise when compromise meant betraying yourself. And he'd given me something else. The courage to believe that I deserved love that didn't require performance, support, that didn't come with strings attached, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than mutual need. The legal battle was over. The inheritance was secure. But more importantly, I'd inherited something far more valuable than money or property, the understanding that my worth wasn't determined by other people's capacity to recognize it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to run art workshops, building a sustainable business, creating community in a place that had been defined by solitude. But tonight, falling asleep in a house that belonged to me in every sense that mattered, I felt ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, I stood in the studio watching my first group of workshop students discover the magic that Ike had shown me decades earlier. 8 women, ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s, had come to the mountain to spend a weekend learning to paint landscapes and, in the process, learning to see the world through artists' eyes. The trick, I told them, echoing words Ike had spoken to me countless times, is to paint what you feel about a place, not just what you see. The emotion is what makes a landscape come alive. Margaret, a retired teacher from Charlotte, was struggling with a view of the valley at sunrise. "I can't get the light right," she said, frustrated. "It looks flat." I stood beside her easel, remembering my own early attempts to capture the mountain light. "What did you feel when you saw that sunrise this morning?" "Like everything was possible," she said without hesitation. "Like the world was beginning again. Then paint that feeling. The light is just the vehicle." As she began to work with looser, more confident strokes, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from helping someone discover their own creative voice. This was what I'd been building towards since accepting Ike's inheritance, not just preserving his legacy, but extending it into something living and growing. The weekend workshops had evolved naturally from my desire to share the mountain's inspiration with other artists. What had started as a practical way to supplement my income had become something more meaningful, a way to create the kind of community I'd always craved but never known how to find. During breaks, the students wandered the property, some sketching. The garden had begun expanding, others sitting quietly by the stream that ran through the lower meadow. The house that had felt too big for one person hummed with conversation and laughter, feeling complete in a way it hadn't since Ike's death. "You're a natural teacher," said Helen, a photographer who'd driven up from Atlanta to try her hand at painting. "Have you thought about expanding the program?" I had been thinking about it. The success of the weekend workshops had exceeded my expectations, and I'd already received inquiries about longer residencies, specialized retreats, even the possibility of partnering with art schools for semester abroad programs. "I want to make sure I don't lose what makes this place special," I said. "It's the intimacy and quiet that creates the magic. Then keep the group small and the focus personal. Don't let it become a business that happens to involve art instead of an art experience that happens to be a business." It was good advice, and it aligned with the principles I learned from Ike about maintaining artistic integrity while building a sustainable life. That evening, after the students had left, I sat in the kitchen making plans for the fall workshops. The application list was growing. Word of mouth was bringing inquiries from across the Southeast, and I was beginning to think I might actually be able to make a living doing exactly what I loved most. Miles arrived just as I was opening a bottle of wine to celebrate another successful weekend. We'd been seeing each other regularly since the legal battles ended, a relationship that had grown slowly and naturally from shared respect into something deeper. "How did it go?" he asked, settling into the chair that had become his during our evening conversations. "Better than I imagined possible. 8 students, 7 finished paintings, and at least 3 people who discovered they're actual artists instead of people who just thought they might like to try painting." "And how do you feel about it? The teaching, I mean." It was a question he asked often, and one I appreciated because it showed he understood that my relationship with this new life was still evolving, like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Not just the painting and teaching, but the whole thing creating. A place where people can come to discover something true about themselves. We'd talked about this before, the way the mountain properties seemed to invite transformation. The way students arrived focused on learning technique and left talking about changing their lives. "There's something I want to show you," I said, leading him into the studio. On my main easel, nearly finished after months of work, was a painting I'd been reluctant to share with anyone. It showed the view from Ike's favorite painting spot, but rendered in my own style, with my own interpretation of the light and color that made this place magical. "It's beautiful," Miles said, studying the canvas with the careful attention he gave to everything that mattered to me. "But it's more than that. It looks like ... hope." He was right. The painting captured not just the physical beauty of the landscape, but the emotional transformation I'd experienced here. The colors were brighter than realistic, the light more luminous than natural, the sense of possibility more vivid than any photograph could capture. "I'm thinking about submitting it to the regional show this fall," I said. "My first time showing my own work instead of just doing illustrations for other people. That's huge. Are you nervous? Terrified? But also excited in a way I haven't felt since I was a kid showing my first painting to Ike." We spent the evening talking about the future, my plans for expanding the workshop program, his thoughts about eventually working part-time so he could spend more time on the mountain, the possibility of building a small guest cottage that could accommodate longer-term artist residencies. But we also talked about the past and how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago when I then fighting my family for the right to inherit my grandfather's legacy. Do you ever miss them? Miles asked as we sat on the front porch, watching stars emerge over the mountains. I miss the idea of them sometimes. The fantasy of having parents who were proud of me and a sister I could call when something good happened. But I don't miss the actual relationships we had, which were built on my willingness to accept less than I deserved. Any regrets about how it ended? I thought about it, watching the familiar constellations appear in the clear mountain sky. I regret that they were incapable of loving people without trying to use them. I regret that I spent years trying to earn something they were never going to freely give. But I don't regret standing up for myself, even though it meant losing them. The next morning, I woke before dawn and walked out to the studio to watch the sunrise through the large windows that faced east. This had become my daily ritual, greeting the day in the space where Ike had created his life's work and where I was creating mine. The painting on my easel caught the early light, and I could see what Miles had meant about hope. The canvas radiated a sense of possibility that reflected not just the beauty of the landscape, but the transformation I'd undergone since moving here. On the table beside my easel was a letter I'd received the week before, my first commission for a major illustration. Project since moving to the mountain. A publishing house in New York wanted me to illustrate a children's book about finding courage in unexpected places. The advance was generous enough to cover my living expenses for 6 months, and the subject matter felt perfectly aligned with my own story. But there was something else on the table that made me smile every time I saw it. A postcard from Claire, sent from an art therapy program in Colorado where she'd enrolled after our final confrontation with our parents. Learning to make art for myself instead of for approval, she'd written on the back. Turns out there's a difference. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to choose yourself even when it's scary. It wasn't a full reconciliation. We still had years of dysfunction to work through, but it was a beginning. And it gave me hope that somewhere in the wreckage of our family, there might be pieces worth salvaging. As the sun climbed higher, flooding the studio with the golden light that made everything look possible, I picked up my brush and added one final touch to the painting, a small figure in the distance, walking toward the mountains with the determined stride of someone who knows exactly where they belong. The painting was finished. The first piece of art I created not as commercial work or as therapy, but as a celebration of a life rebuilt on authentic foundations. I stepped back to look at it and realized that Ike had been right about inheritance. The most valuable things. You can leave someone art, money, or property, but examples and permissions, the example of living authentically, and the permission to value yourself enough to demand real love instead of settling for convenient substitutes. Outside, I could hear the sound of cars on the mountain road, the next group of workshop students arriving for a weekend of discovery. I put away my paints, straightened the studio, and prepared to share once again the gift that Ike had given me. The understanding that art isn't about creating perfect beauty, but about expressing authentic truth. And as I walked toward the house to greet my students, I carried with me the knowledge that I had finally learned the difference between being loved and being needed, between family and relatives, between earning acceptance and deserving respect. The mountain stretched out before me, beautiful and challenging and completely mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt worthy of everything it had to offer. The first snowfall on the mountain didn't arrive with ceremony. It came quietly, dusting the porch railings and softening the ridges in the distance. I watched it from the studio window, coffee in hand, a fire crackling in the wood stove behind me. In that silence, I felt the difference between absence and peace. 6 months had passed since I finalized the settlement with my parents. They made their first repayment installment without contact. True to the agreement, there were no phone calls, no emails, no apologies. Only a bank notification and the strange weight of money returned too late to matter. I didn't expect regret to follow such a clear line, but it did. It curled up beside my pride, whispering versions of the life we could have had if they'd chosen honesty over entitlement. But those ultimate lives were fiction. And the truth fears difficult. Liberating was the life I was actually living. Snow kept falling. Claire wrote again in November. A longer letter this time handwritten, which surprised me. Her loops were tighter than I remembered, more deliberate. You were right, she began. About everything. About how I never really showed up. About how I resented you for earning what I refused to seek. About the way I envied your closeness with Grandpa Ike when I could have had something similar if I hadn't been so busy pretending to be unbothered. She told me about her art therapy program, how using color to process emotion had made her feel more human than anything else ever had. She wrote about evenings spent sketching, mornings spent hiking, and how she'd started volunteering at a local shelter where they offered art to at-risk kids. I don't expect forgiveness, she ended. But if there's a door open, even a crack, I'd like to know. I read her words 3 times before responding. My reply was short, but honest. The door's open, no rush, no pressure. Just come through it when you're ready. It felt good to write that. Not because it made me noble, but because it made me hold December change the light in the studio. Everything became softer, shadows longer, and color felt different. I found myself painting more at dusk drawn to the in-between spaces, where clarity met mystery. One afternoon, I pulled out a blank canvas and began a new series, The Quiet Hours, 6 paintings, each inspired by moments that had no witnesses but carried the most weight, finding Ike's letter, waking alone after a nightmare, June bringing soup and staying to read aloud, Miles brushing my hair back when he thought I was asleep on the porch. I never painted people before, not really. But this series wasn't about portraits. It was about presence. Memory made visible by the 6th canvas. I realized something I hadn't said aloud yet. I was no longer waiting for someone to choose me. I had chosen myself. And in doing so, I built a life that felt not just survivable but meaningful. I spent Christmas alone for the first time in my life. No family gatherings, no strained conversations over roast beef and obligations. Just me, the mountain, a bottle of wine, and a stack of books. I woke to snow, the kind that erased all roads for a day. I made pancakes, watched old movies, lit candles, and opened a small package June had mailed me. A silver keychain in the shape of a paintbrush with the word brave etched into it. Later that night, I received a surprise visitor. Miles, coat dusted with snow, held up a thermos. Hot cider, he said. I figured no one should unwrap solitude entirely alone. We drank it in the studio, surrounded by the Quiet Hours series. He didn't speak much, just looked at the paintings, eyes lingering on the last one. I hadn't told him he was in it, but he knew. You ever wonder how Ike would have reacted to all this? He asked quietly. I think he'd have laughed, then painted a better version of it. That night, as we sat by the fire, not touching, not rushing, just being, I felt it again. That quiet contentment. The sense of belonging that doesn't beg to be acknowledged. By early spring, word about the art retreats had spread beyond North Carolina. A small article in a regional magazine called me the girl who inherited a barn and turned it into a sanctuary. That phrase stuck. People arrived from all over. Some wanted to paint, others just wanted to be near stillness. One woman cried for 20 minutes on the porch before ever picking up a brush. Another man painted only with shades of blue and whispered, I haven't said my daughter's name aloud in years. They left their stories behind like pine needles in the entryway, and I swept them up gratefully. Each one a reminder that grief, like art, required space to unfold. I never marketed the retreats aggressively. They were never meant to scale. I kept the group small. I cooked most of the meals myself. I still mailed handwritten thank you cards. What mattered wasn't the number of students. It was what they left with, proof that they mattered without needing to perform. That's what Ike had given me. Now it was mine to pass on Dot in April. A package arrived. No return address. Inside was a letter, folded neatly between pages of a family Bible I hadn't seen in years. Eliza, it read. This isn't an apology. I don't know if I'm capable of offering one without undermining it with justifications. But I want you to know I've been reading your blog, watching your interviews. You've become someone remarkable, not because you inherited the house, but because you honored what it stood for. I don't expect a reply. I only hope that one day, if the opportunity arises, we can sit at that long kitchen table again, not as adversaries, but as people learning how to be better. It was unsigned, but I knew it was from my mother. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the silence between us finally felt earned. It was the most honest language we'd ever shared. That night, I added one last painting too. The quiet hours, a kitchen table seen through a window, empty but bathed in morning light. A place waiting, not expecting. And that was enough. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.